You're listening to WPKN 89.5 FM in Bridgeport and streaming online at WPKN.org. Reporting and supporting what matters, this is CT Examiner Weekly.
Dr. Henry Lee turned pathology into celebrity with famous cases, including O.J. Simpson, stretching to John Benet Ramsey. Over 5 decades, his crime scene investigations, using blood spatter analysis and other innovative methods, put countless people in jail. But did he get the evidence right? I'm reporter Dan Tepfer with the story.
It's been decades since the Catholic Church was forced to reckon with its history of child sexual abuse. But many towns across the state are still only piecemeal addressing problems in their public schools. Hi, I'm reporter Ally LeMaster, and I have the story, this time in Litchfield, Connecticut.
And in Norwalk, parents and staff at a local elementary school are speaking out to the city's Board of Education about claims of misconduct by a school principal. At least one staff member has accused her of discouraging reports on the suspected abuse and neglect of students. I'm Luke Feeney with that story.
And I'm your host, Brian Scott Smith, and joining me and our reporters is Greg Stroud, Editor-in-Chief of CT Examiner, and Arts Editor Robin Breeding. Welcome to you all. Dr. Henry C. Lee, an internationally recognized forensic evidence expert whose reputation was tarnished by a string of questionable cases later in his career, died on March 27th at his home in Henderson, Nevada. Lee had close connections with the University of New Haven, as well as being chief criminologist for the state of Connecticut and director of the Connecticut State Police Forensics Science Laboratory, among other duties. Our reporter Dan Tepfer joins us remotely to talk about Lee. Dan.
So I first met Henry Lee in 1982 at the scene of a particularly grisly murder in Eastern Connecticut, and he wowed everyone with his forensic insight.
So Dan, you were like a young reporter at the time, starting out in Bridgeport, probably a lot of crime. And were a lot of the sort of murders, was there sort of a frustration that murders weren't being solved? And was this something that Henry Lee came in and started helping solve murders? And so there was an excitement about that?
Well, this was not only in Bridgeport, this was statewide, that if a murder wasn't solved by confession, in many cases it wasn't solved. And this has been going on for years. And Henry Lee came onto the scene with his forensic science, and all of a sudden he could trace, blood to right to the hand of the killer. And this was exciting. This was incredibly new, and it took the state and the world by storm.
So I was talking to a defense attorney who handles a lot of murder cases, and he told me a couple of things. One, he said that nowadays, what's changed is there's so much evidence out there. There's video evidence, there's DNA evidence, there's cell phone evidence, that it's changed so much. And that actually he was telling me he was glad that he actually had represented someone for the first time, he thought, who might actually be innocent. But that he said that he sort of believed that there was very, very few wrongful convictions for murder. And so what do we know in this case, or how has Henry Lee sort of changed the way we think of evidence, sort of for the better and for the worse, maybe?
Well, as Henry Lee began testifying, and he used to have this role in which he'd walk into a courtroom, get on the witness box and say, "Good morning, Your Honor. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury." And he had them in his hand. I mean, defense attorneys used to tell me, we can't beat Henry Lee. Once he starts talking, everybody in the courtroom falls in love with the guy, and he can say anything he wants and people are going to believe it. And because there wasn't any counter evidence or experts at the time, he was getting guilty verdicts based on his testimony. And that changed with new experts coming on, many that he actually brought into the state who started saying, well, no, what Henry Lee is saying is not what I found. And all of a sudden, prosecutors started questioning what Henry Lee was saying about a crime scene.
So, Dan, what were some of the more controversial cases?
Well, in 99, a young boy and his mother were executed in Bridgeport. Henry Lee was brought in by the prosecution along with other experts, and Lee's scenario of what he said happened completely contradicted everything else, what everybody else was saying, including the medical examiner. And at that point, prosecutors saying, there's something wrong here. What's going on? So they decided not to use Lee. And this was a major blow to him because it was quite a high profile case. After that, he started doing a lot of defense work. But then in around 2015, cases were looked at. Some of Lee's earlier cases from the 80s were looked at by experts. And all of a sudden, they're saying, wait a minute, there wasn't blood there that he said was there. That wasn't blood on a sneaker. That wasn't blood on a towel that he claimed was there. And in 3 cases back in 2019, 3 murder cases were actually overturned, one in New Milford, because they found that his testimony had been inaccurate.
So, we have Henry Lee. He had a career that was, it's about 60 years. It started in Taiwan. It continued in Connecticut. Over that span of time, relatively few cases were overturned. But I think maybe is it fair to say that there's this lingering suspicion that maybe that we should look back at some of those old cases? And it's something that we've been looking at really, particularly around New Haven, frankly. We've been wanting to take a closer look at prosecutions and old prosecutions and say, did we get this right? Because are there consequences for getting it wrong? It's one of those tough things as a prosecutor. You prosecute so many cases that you can't. There's only so much. Everyone makes mistakes.
Well, the consequences right now are civil cases that result in the state paying millions of dollars to people who were wrongly incarcerated. The Innocence Project has done a lot of work specifically on New Haven cases, in which they claim that errors were made in evidence and testimony, and they've been very successful in a number of cases.
So one thing, though, is what we know is comparing 1982 to now, there just aren't as many murders. And, there just isn't as much. I don't know if Henry Lee is kind of being put out of work by the simple fact that there are just less murders to solve.
That's part of it. But we have a very active state police forensic lab where Henry Lee, through the 80s, was the sole person who was doing this. You've now got 20 or 30 people who work on cases out of a very modern lab.
Daniel, it's great reporting, and obviously your recollections as well, personal recollections, which are always great to hear from you. Thank you for that. On our next story now, last fall, CT examiners Ally LeMaster broke the news that Litchfield school officials had been warned for decades about track coach David Driscoll's dealings with young boys in his care. But it was only after his death in September that his sexual abuse of tens of dozens of boys came to light in the public. Our reporter Ally LeMaster joins us in the studio now to talk about the latest lawsuit filed in the case. Ally.
So recently, there was a 3rd lawsuit filed against Litchfield Public Schools. And in the complaint, it states that the schools continued to employ Driscoll despite knowing the fact that there were allegations he sexually abused middle school students in his care.
So in this case, when were the first warnings that the district received? Do you have a general timeline before, was it the 70s, the early 80s?
So the timeline is a little It's a little unclear right now. Going back to the 80s, there were allegations in his personnel file that he would threaten to pull boys' shorts down if they didn't run fast enough. And in a 1991 state police investigation, there was an allegation that administrators knew, I would say roughly in the mid 80s, that there was an allegation Driscoll sexually abused students.
So, I mean, part of it is that this actually stretched not just it wasn't just in Litchfield, but we actually followed this case, or you followed the case, to Maine, where he was a summer counselor, and there was an investigation in Maine as well. And part of maybe what kept him protected him was that it was a two-state, who's responsible, where did the crimes occur, will they pursue them across state lines? And ultimately, that criminal investigation was dropped, I believe.
Correct. He was never arrested for anything that he did while he was alive.
But now, as soon as what prompted these people to come forward? I think we had like maybe a dozen men right now that have come forward about incidents that they claim.
Right. So people came forward after Driscoll's death. He was a prominent track and field coach. He helped train students to go to the Junior Olympics. He helped establish the Litchfield Road Race. So a lot of people, when he died, they wanted to celebrate him. But, when this was coming forward, when they were trying to honor Driscoll, many boys came forward and they were like, now men said that Driscoll abused them.
Ally, can you give us a sense of, have you managed to speak to any of these now men who were abused or via their lawyers? Because this is a hard thing to come forward about, whether you're male or female, to come forward years later and say, I was sexually abused, or something happened to me that was wrong. So can you give us a sense of maybe some discussions you've had and how they feel about this, even though they're coming forward now?
The allegations came forward when they were about to bury Driscoll, and a lot of these men came forward and they went into the Litchfield Town Green and they were like, this is what happened to us. I believe it was less than a dozen. A lot of community activists were also involved, trying to promote their claims.
As I recall, there were some of these boys and their parents that came forward years ago. And potentially, we've been sort of trying to nail down the story. I think you nailed it down pretty well, that at least one boy faced had a threatening response. He was taken in a car by a couple of men and interviewed, and it's unclear who those men were, but it clearly intimidated the family and the young boy. And I mean, one of the things that we're looking at is, what are the responsibilities of the district? And did they fulfill those responsibilities? And one responsibility that we know of is that there's this idea of a mandated reporter, right? That if you have certain professions, if you know about something, you have to report that to, is it the state or the police? You have to say something. And in this case, do we have any DCF reports or these Department of Children and Family reports?
So what's hazy about this investigation is that these allegations, the police report happened over 30 years ago. So it's hard getting concrete answers as to who filed a DCF report, when was a DCF report filed, that sort of thing. So I think potentially in the lawsuit, this will be maybe sorted out, figuring out what happened, what administrators knew. Seems like they knew to some extent quite a bit, but exactly, who was notified and when.
I think what's interesting about cases like this is the disconnect between the Board of Education and the school district itself. And I believe it's something that really, in a way, still exists now. I mean, if you try to ask a question on a school-related matter, one side says it's the other one that needs to answer, then the other one says it's, no, it's actually them. And so these disconnects and these almost like silo situations, I think, don't help. Certainly situations like this, where obviously there's these serious allegations. Greg, last comment on this, because we do need to move on.
I mean, really, just to move this into the next story, I think, with Luke Feeney, is that he was just attending a Board of Education meeting in Norwalk, and parents come forward and they make comments. And in public comments, at a Board of Education meeting, guess what happens? You ask a question, you state something, and what do you get? You get silence. And it's actually part of the rules, the sort of self-imposed rules, that you ask a question and they say they're allowed to say nothing. And so this can certainly be frustrating for parents. And I'd be curious to hear from Luke about his story of a different case in Norwalk, a very different case, but parents that are frustrated about conduct there.
So let's get into our next story. Ally, thank you. So our final story today, the school board in Norwalk listened as school staff criticised the conduct and their oversight of an elementary school principal at a recent Board of Education, calling into question the district's adherence to state laws intended to protect students in their care. As Greg said, Luke Feeney, who attended the meeting in Norwalk, joins us in the studio with the latest on that. So Luke, explain to us this particular story.
Yeah, so Silverman Elementary School is a dual language K-5 school in Norwalk. It enrolls around 450 students, and the current principal, Yasina Paredes, was appointed in 2022. At last night's Board of Education meeting, around a dozen or so parents really raised several pretty serious allegations against her. They cited a report with the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities, the state's chief civil rights and law enforcement agency. And in that report, it was alleged that Paredes spanked a subordinate on her butt. They also added that she allegedly discouraged staff from calling DCF in suspected cases of abuse or neglect. She bullied staff, and she also played favorites with students.
So it's one of those situations where there's clearly a lot of allegations here. I mean, what I think they submitted maybe 8 or 9 letters, a variety of allegations. There had been a letter of reprimand from a few years ago. So how did the Board of Education respond to these complaints or these concerns?
Well, and it's interesting because you sort of alluded to it earlier. Something that I thought was interesting was they were actually not allowed to mention her by name when they were complaining. One of the rules is if you're complaining about an employee, you can't name a specific employee. So despite the fact that kind of everyone in the room knew who was being talked about, everyone had to keep saying the principal, which I thought was kind of interesting.
So we ran into this issue with Eric Obernaur's reporting in Stamford recently, which was the idea of can you disparage, can you criticize someone personally? And various boards, including boards of education, boards of representatives, have been trying to limit what the public can say. And so in this case, they can't even mention the person. So person after, speaker after speaker comes up without mentioning this principal, and the Board of Education then, do they not say anything at all?
So yeah, they didn't really address the comments when the, public comment session ended. It probably ran for about 45 minutes. I spoke with board chair Howard White after. He didn't really respond to the allegations. He said basically something to the effect of, we appreciate people raising concerns and we're going to look into those concerns. But, what does that even mean?
Robin?
Yeah, I was just thinking, is there anything, do these documents get entered into some kind of a formal complaint process, or it's just to have them disappear seems rather.
That is an interesting question that I wish I could give you a more direct answer to. I watched a parent finish speaking, and then the folder with the documents that Greg was referring to earlier, she handed them to every single member of the board. I don't know what will happen with those. I don't know what the board did with those. I just know that they have them.
I mean, what you see in part, though, is that if you have a complaint, and maybe this is advice, it's, to people out there, it's create a paper trail. If there's a paper trail, there's more accountability. There's the ability for the press then to have a record that we can turn to in a week, in a month, in 10 years. who knows what will happen? And it's really, and also we find cases where we follow employees from district to district, and it's really hard if all the discipline happens quietly to find out what happened in the last job, and whether it's sort of just an isolated incident. I think that the principal in this case said, I was joking.
Yeah.
And it's easier to judge that if we have a complete record, and so in this case, at least, by submitting a document to the Board of Education, you have created a public record.
Robin.
Is that paper or is that digital? And does that matter?
It shouldn't matter.
Okay.
In either, if you formally submitted, in either case, it should be a public record. You can also ask people to read letters into the record.
And the other thing I would say as well is, obviously under the Freedom of Information Act, ask for their personnel file. I've done it in the past, and I've got people's personnel files. Some of it's been redacted, etc. But see what's in their personnel file. Are there any letters or communications in there where they were in fact sanctioned on a particular matter or not? So that sort of information is available. But as Greg said, it really is about creating that trail, so that and also for the listener who's listening to this, if they're in that situation, if the press is there, hand them a pack of papers or whatever as well that you're handing over, so that they've got the immediate access to that. Going to give you the final comment on this, Greg, and then we need to move on.
Certainly whether it's in Norwalk or Litchfield, I know in Litchfield, they'll be digging through a paper. I hear that there's a lot of boxes of paper sitting up in an attic that they're going to be digging through. In Norwalk, I think we're still following this issue. Luke has heard, just to clarify, Luke has heard that this principal will be reassigned, and that was announced. So we'll find out where she's been reassigned and if this problem has been resolved. So stay tuned.
Greg and Luke, great reporting on that. Thanks ever so much for that particular story. It's time now to take a look at events and things to do in and around Connecticut with Robin. What have you got for us this week, Robin?
All right, Brian. Well, it's spring, as you all know. Things are coming out, and it's time to trim some trees. And so on April 18th at the Flanders Nature Center in Woodbury, they're holding a chainsaw safety course, and it's a beginner class, and it will be a full-day class. And I'm a person who really likes to use a chainsaw, and I feel pretty comfortable with it. And I think you should get out there and learn how to get comfortable with the chainsaw if you need to do that kind of work.
Absolutely. And I was looking up some details. I was talking with Robin before we started recording this, and US-wide, I couldn't find Connecticut-specific results, but US-wide, apparently every year, around 36,000 people are treated in emergency rooms across the nation for chainsaw injuries. So it is a big deal. I thought the choice was interesting, and then, as I said, did the research. But absolutely, they are dangerous things, and you need to understand how to use them properly.
You
do, and go out and get yourself a pair of chaps.
That's
part of what will save you is a pair of chaps.
Yeah, all the safety gear. That will cost you $150, and as Robin said, that's April 18th at Flanders Nature Center in Woodbury. What else do you have for us?
All right, this one I really like. And if I were a child, I would be excited about it. April 18th at Old Sturbridge Village up in Sturbridge, Mass. So they have this whole program that's called Night in the Museum. And if you were a kid and you read the book, The Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Baisley Frankenwheeler, this is for you. Parents can send their kids to the museum, and they get flashlights and maps and all this clue stuff, and they spend the night at the museum. Cool?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
So in
6-year-old
this
me would
case-
have eaten that up.
Yeah. And it's outdoors, right? At least it's partially
But I think they throw, clues all over the museum, and they're supervised, obviously, and parents can also do it. But, they hunt for clues and make experiments and investigate the past. It sounds fun.
That is a phenomenal thing because, I've been to Old Sturbridge Village and it's huge.
Yeah,
It's not a small place. There's lots of nooks and crannies and all sorts of things. And that is just a wonderful thing. And I don't think, to be honest with you, I think I'd even do that.
I would too.
I don't even think you need to be a kid.
And it's ongoing. So if you go to the website, they have many opportunities to do that.
And that will cost you between $60 and $75. And as Robin said, starts April 18th up there in Sturbridge, Massachusetts. What else do you have for us?
All right. Next up, April 25th at the North Haven Fairgrounds. There's the 117th annual CT Sheep, Wool, and Fiber Festival, and that's in North Haven. And from what I gather, it's, all things sheep, wool gathering, wool carding, spinning wheel demonstrations, but there are lots of vendors. And so if you're a knitter or a rug maker or anything, it would be pretty cool. They have, sheep there that the kids can see. And I think it looks pretty fun.
The research also says to promote the keeping of sheep in Connecticut as well, which, you can just have one. You don't have to have a whole herd of sheep if you don't have the, obviously, the space there. And also Yukon apparently is involved in that, which is not surprising because they are experts in many areas. Greg?
And, it makes sense in a state that depends on small farms. We can't compete with Florida. We can't compete with California in our scale, but we can compete in value added and quality. And so this was a case where it's just fiber arts, sheep, small farms. It sounds like a great event.
Absolutely. April 25th, again, North Haven Fairgrounds, which is in North Haven. Next one, Robin.
All right, April 25th and 26th, there's a 2-day workshop of monotype and sheen collé, which is a printing technique. And this is at the Center for Contemporary Printmaking in Norwalk. This is a really great center. They have lots of classes, and there's not that many resources for printmakers in Connecticut. So they hold lots of workshops. And this one is sheen collé is when you use, maybe you use cut pieces of cardboard and other things that you can put on a plate, ink it up, and send it through the press. So I think it's a great school.
It's interesting as well, again, because it's again, the research you provided here, it says it allows thin paper and rice paper and vintage books, all these wonderful things that if you've got access to, you can turn them into these beautiful pieces of art, and obviously using fibers and all that. I mean, I'm just looking at the graphic that goes with it, and although it's quite abstract, it's stunning actually just looking at this, and it's it's been printed off on this paper. So 2-day workshop, that is April 25th to April 26th. It will set you back between $275 and $375, but I think well worth it if you certainly are the creative type. Last one.
All right, last one. Art Gallery. It's called Art 06870 Gallery in Old Greenwich, and that's the zip code. A show just opened called Necessary Voices, and I think it's a very smart gallery. There are not that many galleries around the state that I see doing fairly sophisticated work. This gallery is putting out some really nice pieces. This show brings together a bunch of voices that challenge dominant narratives and engage in sort of social kind of commentary. And it's curated by 4 women. You can go to the website, art06870.org, I believe, and check it out.
And it's on until early May, like you said, only just opened, on until early May. Gallery hours, Monday to Thursday, 4 to 7 p.m, all by appointment, it says, and weekends, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. by appointment.
Just a quick follow-up on that. This gallery also has a major mission to have children make art. So they have an outreach program in the community, and part of the money that comes from these sales and things goes towards funding programs for children.
Absolutely wonderful. Robin, as usual, a superb and eclectic selection of events to do in and around the state and just outside. Thank you for that. That's all for this edition. My thanks, as always, to Greg, Ally, Luke, Dan, and, of course, Robin. Don't forget to check out the digital pages of ctexaminer.com for more stories and our events calendar for all the latest local happenings. And while you're there, why not subscribe to make sure you don't miss out on all the week's news? It's just $20 for the entire year. This is CT Examiner Weekly, reporting and supporting what matters. I'm Brian Scott Smith. Thank you for listening.